My name is Dan D'Amico. I'm the Associate Director at the Political Theory Project here at Brown, tonight's sponsor and host, so to speak. Our event this evening is entitled End of the Party, the Future of Conservatism in America, and we're joined tonight by Bill Kristol. After serving in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations, Bill Kristol founded the Weekly Standard in 1995 and edited the influential magazine for over 2 decades. Now, as founding director of Defending Democracy Together, an organization dedicated to defending America's liberal democratic norms, principles, and institutions, Kristol is in the midst of the national debate on issues ranging from American foreign policy to the future of the Republican Party and the meaning of American conservatism. Please join me in welcoming Bill Kristol.
Thanks, Dan. It's good to be here, back here at Brown. I haven't been here in a while, so I've taught actually before going to Washington in '85. I taught at Penn, then at Harvard, so it's the Brown of the South and the Brown of the North, I guess. Actually spent a lot of time here as an undergraduate for some reason for various Harvard Brown football games and hockey games and stuff, but it's nice to be here in a more academic environment. I think the future of conservatism is too depressing a topic, so I'll skip that and talk about something else. Somehow being here back in the university makes me feel more like a political scientist, which I once sort of was, more political philosophy. But so maybe I'll talk a little bit more about really not try to give you an analytical sense of where I think we are politically. You can ask me about my own views about things, and I won't be reticent about that, but I won't try to persuade you that you should be pro-Trump, not that I would persuade you of that, or anti-Trump, or Republican or Democrat, but really, what is this moment? It is a very interesting moment, somewhat worrisome moment, I would say, but a very interesting moment in American politics. Let me say a word about 2016, the most recent presidential election. Very unusual election. Produced a president unlike any we've ever had before. And I really don't say that pejoratively. I just mean analytically again. We've never had a president in the U.S. who hadn't held elective office before, governor, senator, vice president, congressman in a couple of cases, or hadn't been a cabinet official, or hadn't been a general in the U.S. Army. We've had 44 presidents before Trump, 43 if Grover Cleveland gets counted twice for his non-consecutive terms. They all had this character. America's a pretty, innovative nation, but in its choices for president, it's actually been very traditional, much more than most countries. No private sector people, very few real outsiders. Certainly in the last 40, 50 years, very conventional, you might say, for better or worse, candidates. Usually the next person in line was nominated, often a vice president, often in the Republican case, someone who had run before and lost. All that goes out the window in 2016 for the Republican nomination. Hillary Clinton, a much more traditional candidate, and then she loses. So we have our first, again, non-traditional president in that sense. And that's to say nothing of the fact that Trump ran against his party, ran against the legacies of Bush and McCain and Romney, ran against their policies and international relations, trade, immigration, some aspects of economic policy. Pretty unusual in American politics, certainly in the last, 40, 50, 60 years, for a party, last 50 years, I'd say, for a party to nominate someone who runs against the mainstream of that party. Sometimes the parties move a little to the right, a little to the left, but normally a much more traditional kind of candidate gets nominated. In this case, Trump, benefiting from a fractured field, 16 other candidates, wins the nomination, and then in an upset wins the election. On the Democratic side, one thing that's forgotten about 2016 is that Bernie Sanders gets 43%, I think it is, of the national vote running against Hillary Clinton. So think of it this way. 2016, time of peace and prosperity, more or less. Relative peace. A conflict in Afghanistan's going on, but pretty low grade. World's a mess, but we're not in the middle of something like Vietnam. Prosperity would come back mostly from 2008, 2007, 2008. Obviously, some parts of the country had done better than others. There turned out there were real problems in a lot of middle America, but still, we're not in the middle of the Great Depression. We're not in the middle of the Great Depression. We're not in the middle of the Vietnam War. We don't have race riots in the streets. People are doing okay, mostly in America. Crime is down over 25 years. Other things are, there's a lot of technological change, but a lot of that's a good thing, presumably, right? And 45% of the Republican primary vote goes to Trump, running against the elite and the establishment of his party. 43% of the Democratic primary vote goes to Sanders, running against the elite and the establishment and the traditional policies of his party. And I'm not comparing Sanders and Trump in terms of moral character or their policies, but just as both outsiders running against their parties. It's pretty stunning. Almost half the primary electorate votes against the more traditional views and representatives of each party. I think if you asked a historian so I think there are some political scientists here, maybe there's some historians or social scientists, like when would that happen? When would you have almost half of each party rebelling against the establishment of that party? You'd say, well, probably at a time of great economic distress or a time of a really terrible foreign policy failure or things blowing up all around the world. It's riots in the streets. There's some of that in 2016, but it's a pretty unusual, I'd say. It's a little hard to explain, actually, why there was such discontent with the elites and the establishment in 2016. But there obviously was. And I think what that shows is that the elites and establishment were out of touch. It shows that some of the developments of the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, which some of us, and I would include myself in this, thought were pretty good and things were okay. We may have underestimated the costs of some of these economic and cultural changes. I'll come back to that in a minute. But 2016, it feels like 2016 was the end of an era. Think of it this way. Cold War ends in 89 when the Berlin Wall falls, or let's say 91 when the Soviet Union collapses. We have 3 presidencies from 92 through 2016. 3 8-year presidencies, Clinton, Bush, Obama. In each case, pretty conventional is too strong, but pretty mainstream candidates. I mean, Obama a little less so because he takes on Hillary Clinton, who's favored in 2008. But 3 candidates who represent the views of their parties. They each win and get reelected. They don't have primary challenges. Congress goes back and forth, ends up being about evenly divided for the entire 24 years. If you look at it, Republicans have a slight edge. Democrats have the presidency for 16 of those 24. Republicans have Congress for about the same, differs by House, but about the same percentage of that 24. So divided government. And in retrospect, for all the turmoil, and there was a lot of turmoil, I suppose you could argue a fairly stable political era. The parties don't change that much. The people don't change that much. The proof of that, of course, is that Hillary Clinton is the nominee in 2016 after Bill Clinton had been the nominee at the beginning of that era in 1992. And Jeb Bush is the front runner, though of course he doesn't win, but the front runner for the Republican nomination in 2016 at the end of an era in which his father was the nominee in 1992 and his brother was the nominee in 2000 and 2004. I mean, one reason Trump did so well, I think, and to some degree Sanders, is that voters looked up in late 2015. They were unhappy with the way things were. They wanted change. And the party establishments were giving them another Bush and another Clinton. I mean, it really is kind of astonishing when you think about it. It's like, we want change. We want something new. We want something different. Hey, do we have a deal for you? You know, the spouse of a former president who also was the Secretary of State of the then current president on the Democratic side, and even worse, really, or even more startling, the son and brother of the 2 most recent Republican presidents. And you can understand why voters looked at that and thought, hey, they're not really getting the message that we do not want more of the same. And I do think that's one thing that made Sanders possible, but particularly Trump possible. So I do think when historians look back, they'll think that 1992 to 2016 was an era in American politics. Some good things, some bad things, a lot of turmoil, some trends that continued and accentuated during the era, partisanship, for example, increasing polarization in Congress, partisanship in Congress, bitter fights over Supreme Court nominations and so forth. But that probably was a coherent era, and it's hard to believe that it didn't end in 2016. We're now in uncharted waters. So if you're if you're doing your sort of, periods of American history, I would say the immediate post-Cold War era lasts about 25 years. I think it's not a terrible era for the country, incidentally. People are in my opinion, too unhappy about how things are, but that's my judgment. But I think we're now in really new circumstances. And one lesson I take from that, again, just analytically, whatever you like, whatever you prefer, whatever you'd like to see happen, is don't expect the rules of 1992 to 2016 to sort of hold in this new era. One characteristic of a new era is precisely that things happen that no one would have expected to happen 5 or 10 or 20 years before. You're always surprised. A lot of people my age end up saying, that's not supposed to happen. We've been through this before. This is how it's going to work out. And then it doesn't work out this way. I think that was very true in the 60s and 70s, after a previous era of 20 or 30 years of a certain pattern of American politics. People kept getting surprised. One change led to another. One change led to a reaction. You start off with the Goldwater and then a movement, and then you have a McGovern movement, and then you have Reagan as president. I mean, you get a lot of whipsawing in these eras of change and fluidity and unpredictability. And no one expects it at the beginning of these eras. So I think we're in an era much more like, and maybe I'll make this point now, I was going to make it later, but I think an era that will end up looking more like 1960 to 1980. So let me then like 1992 to 2016, which means it requires a little bit of study of history and a little bit of imagination to think what the next 20 years could be like. But think of 1960 to 1980, if I can take 2 minutes on a history here before you all were born. 1960, Kennedy runs against Nixon, Vice President Nixon, Senator Kennedy, totally normal kind of candidates, both kind of young actually, but very, very close race. No one thinks anything much is at stake, honestly. They don't differ much on foreign policy. It's not even clear they differ much on domestic policy. Political scientists are writing books about how there's a deadlock of democracy because you can't get anything through Congress anyway. Things haven't changed much. The 50s was a fairly slow-moving, you might say, consolidation after World War II, pretty prosperous era for many Americans. Some gradual changes in civil rights and so forth. No one, I think it's safe to say, very few people in 1960 expected the 60s to happen or the 70s. And what happens in those 20 years? President Kennedy, unfortunately, gets assassinated in 63, obviously. The Goldwater Republicans, the conservatives, take over the Republican Party in 64. Goldwater wins the nomination, the first non-Eastern establishment type to win the Republican nomination in a quarter century. Huge upset. No one expected that. Then he gets clobbered by Johnson, the incumbent, in 64. Johnson's riding high. Amazing spurt of legislation, Great Society, Civil Rights Act, so all kind of, Medicare, obviously, huge expansion, large expansion of government, also Vietnam. Civil rights revolution accelerates. Race relations, I don't know if race relations really become worse, but race relations become more fraught, I suppose you'd say. Expectations, reality doesn't keep up to expectations. Riots, Martin Luther King assassinated in 68. And in 68, Johnson, who was elected, think about this, was 61% of the vote in 1964, is forced out of office, forced out of running for re-election by a challenge by a little-known senator in the Democratic primary, Gene McCarthy. And then Bobby Kennedy gets in, and Johnson decides not to run for re-election. Nixon comes back, amazingly, in 68, having lost a race for governor of California in 62, and everyone said he was finished. Wallace runs as a third-party candidate representing Southern segregationists, carries 5 states. Nixon barely wins in 68. So Nixon wins in 70, Nixon's president. Democrats now have a rebellion within their party, and the McGovern wing of the Democratic Party takes over, the dovish wing, the more progressive wing, we'd say today, from the old-fashioned Johnson-Humphrey Democrats. In 72, McGovern's the nominee. Nixon clobbers him. So in 2 election cycles, we go from Democrats winning 60% of the vote, Johnson in 64, to Republicans winning 60% of the vote, Nixon in 72. And I'm in college at this point, so I remember this a little bit. And everyone, the Democrats are finished, Nixon's on top of the world. Maybe there'll be a new Republican majority. I think Kevin Phillips wrote a book called The Emerging Republican Majority in 71, about 70 or 71. Nixon has Watergate happen to him, leaves office, resigns. In August of 74, huge Democratic victory in that year's congressional elections. In 76, Jimmy Carter, a one-term governor from Georgia, totally unknown. I mean, at this time in 75, which would be the equivalent year, Jimmy Carter was about as well known as, I don't know, Governor Bullock of Montana or someone, by not quite as well known as Hickenlooper, of Colorado, wins the nomination, huge upset. Reagan primaries Ford, challenges President Ford in the primary, almost beats him. Carter wins the general election by a point after being ahead by about 25 points. Big Ford comeback, falls short. Carter becomes president, not a successful presidency, a lot of people think. And so Carter gets primaried by Kennedy in 1980. Reagan comes back and wins the Republican nomination. Reagan beats Carter with John Anderson, a liberal Republican, running as a third-party candidate and getting about 7% of the vote, though at one point looking like he might get about 15% of the vote. So 20 years, no 8-term presidencies. Every incumbent president is primaried. Nixon in 72, the only partial exception, and even he actually has a couple of minor primary challenges. The political pendulum swings wildly back and forth. Big social and cultural changes during these years, obviously, civil rights, feminism, environmentalism, and so forth. 20 years of genuine turmoil and upset. One could argue, I would argue actually, that the country comes out of those 20 years stronger. We had to go through a lot of that to get to where we ended up in 1980, perhaps. And you could then argue that we do pretty well for the next. We win the Cold War. We have quite a lot of peace and prosperity in the 80s, and then post-Cold War, we have those 24 years that I mentioned. But that, American politics sometimes looks like it has for the last 24 years. 8-term presidencies, a lot of bitter debates, but ultimately policy really within the 40-yard lines, budget deals, showdowns, government shutdowns, debt ceiling fights. But at the end of the day, do any big policies really change that much post-Reagan? Arguably, not that much, really. It's amazing. If you look at the federal budget from 1998, let's say 1995, 96, 97, and compare it with the federal budget of 2015 or so, look at the distribution, it's not very different. The programs are still the same programs. The entitlements have grown some. Defense spending has actually gone up a little, and then gone back down as a percentage of GDP. Debt's higher than it was. Congress is a little more polarized than it was, but it was already getting pretty partisan and polarized. So that period, the last 20 years, is the stable period. The period from 60 to 80 is the volatile period. Everyone's assumption is, because if not you, your parents, let's say, and some of your teachers grew up, in politics in the last 20 or 25 years, everyone's assumption is that's what politics is supposed to look like. Politics can just as easily look like it did from 1960 to 1980. And I think if you had to make a bet, what you could bet that the next 20 years will look more like the 60s and 70s. Volatile, fluid, unpredictable, big cultural and social changes perhaps, big clashes of views as we had in the 60s and 70s, and so forth. I think one reason to expect that is the technological changes and the societal changes that are hitting now, and which are partly responsible, I would say, for Donald Trump's victory too. I'm generally a skeptic when people say that everything's changed, and I grew up in a generation, the baby boomers, which was full of itself and full of how important it was and how unique it was and how everything was changing so much faster than it used to. I remember being told this all the time when I was in high school and college, and not being told that we all said it, It's so we're so much more, open to change than our parents and grandparents, and so forth. Big conceit of the late 60s and the 70s. Totally false, I would say. My grandparents' generation went through so much more technological change than I did. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and there were the highways, and there were planes, and there was television, and there were movies. Now, there wasn't Netflix, and there were certain the planes were the planes weren't really very different at all, and the highways weren't very different at all, and the cars were a little different. It's actually surprising how little, in some ways, technological change there has been from about, I'd say 1950, post-World War II, till about, let's say, 2000. Whereas the preceding 50 or 75 years, if you grew up before automobiles, automobiles, airplanes, obviously, telephones were very primitive, very rare, kind of. Obviously, no radio or TV, movies. that wasn't that long ago, right? That was growing up in 1900. That really is a different set of technological. That's a different society to live in, right? And so change slowed down, I would argue, in certain ways. Anyway, I only make that point to say that I'm sort of a skeptic when people started saying, I was a skeptic in 95, 98, 2000, when people said this communications revolution, the internet, the personal computer, and then the mobile device, which came along, obviously the iPhone, Facebook, et cetera, that all of that would really change things. But I think I was wrong about that. I mean, that is put together. Any one of those things maybe isn't such a big deal. The internet, at some level was just a faster way of getting information. Google is ultimately not that different from, having immediate access to a universal library. I mean, some aspects of it you can explain in terms of older patterns, but I think especially with the iPhone and the instant availability of information and instant communication and social media, we are living in a different environment as citizens than we did 25 years ago. And I think that's one reason why it's unlikely that our politics will look the way they did before all these technological changes. Globalization is a very big change. I mean, we had a world economy, world trade in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It was increasing as a percentage of GDP, but the China going quasi-capitalist, let's say, in the late 70s, India going quasi-market in 1991, the admission of China in particular to the World Trade Organization in, 99, I think. I mean, that was a big deal. We've seen some of the economic consequences in Middle America. Trump capitalized on some of the unhappiness about the flow of jobs and the amount of low-paid, of cheaper labor that was available now in the world economy as a result of China and India and Vietnam and many other places coming into the global economy. But it's a huge shock to the system. I mean, basically 1 billion plus people coming into the economy very quickly, within 10 or 15 or 20 years. If you look at history, when that kind of thing happens, it's a shock. Look at the Industrial Revolution. And there's popular discontent, there are movements, radical movements on both sides, governments fall. I mean, this is what, if you read, early 19th century European history, this is kind of what the story is. And this is true of other eras too. It's true in America too, with rapid industrialization. So the globalization, the revolution is a very big deal. I would argue, incidentally, it was a very good thing for the world, certainly, and for us, mostly. I mean, bringing 1 billion plus people out of poverty in Asia, but letting them bring themselves out of poverty in Asia is not a trivial moral achievement. Conquering various diseases around the world, having infant mortality fall by 80, 90% in some places is not a trivial achievement. And people who talk about the last 20, 30, 40 years as kind of horrible time for humanity, everything's terrible, we've made no progress in anything, really need to step back and look at just some of the basic indices of human well-being, which have really done pretty well, you could argue, maybe done better than ever before, actually, in the post-World War II period, and actually even better in the past 25 years, especially if you count the giant Asian countries, but also that would be true of Africa, incidentally, and lots of other poorer parts of the world. But globalization's a big shock. The automation is a big shock. I mentioned the communications revolution, and now we have robotics and AI, artificial intelligence, and it's pretty clear that, again, that revolution is going to be as big, I would say, probably, as aspects of the Industrial Revolution, in terms of transforming all kinds of aspects of our life. Driverless cars, medicine, I mean, you can, obviously, a million examples of this. Amazon, versus bricks and mortar stores. Higher education has been one of the most resistant to change. Like, I'm standing here and you're sitting there, and it seems like a fairly nice modernized building, so maybe it has changed a little, but I was going to say, but is this really different than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago? Whereas so many other aspects of life are wildly different than they were 20 or 30 years ago. It will affect higher education, it will affect K through 12 education. It will affect an awful lot of things in our lives. You put together globalization, automation, particularly the communications revolution, I'd say, and computers and AI. And then finally, I would say the cultural, in America at least, the cultural and ethnic changes. We've had pretty high rates of immigration. We have about as high a percentage of Americans not born here as has ever been the case. I'm pretty liberal on immigration, so I think this is on net a good thing, but it is a shock to a culture, to a society. We've had major social changes, obviously, in terms of gender roles, in terms of the acceptance of different sexual orientations and the like. I mean, I think on the whole, that's been a good thing too. But it's a lot of changes happen pretty quickly. And obviously when that happens, you get reactions to those changes, you get people who want them to happen even faster, a lot of impatience, and you get a heightening of the tensions in society. I think if you put all that together, globalization, automation, social and cultural changes, you're looking at a recipe for a certain amount of discontent, disarray, unhappiness or uncertainty about where we're going to go, a lot of fights about a lot of issues, some of them symbolic, some of them real, a lot of desire for simple solutions to complex problems. I think Trump, I will say editorially, benefited a lot from that. You know, I talked with one of the Hillary Clinton political operative after the campaign, and I said, I mean, you know, sort of what happened, what everyone said. And he said, look, Trump offered solutions to problems. They were, in his view, and I would agree with this, very simple solutions. They were not good solutions. They were not real solutions often. But if you were a voter out there discombobulated by what had been happening, Trump seemed to want to do something about it and had a few ideas about what to do. You know, no foolish foreign wars, build a wall, cut back no Muslim immigrants so there wouldn't be any terrorism. I mean, things that I don't approve of and I think are actually damaging to the country to even argue, to make the case for, but nonetheless, he had sort of solutions of a kind. Hillary Clinton had complex, position papers with many complicated reforms of government programs, and no one could summarize in 3 sentences what Hillary Clinton was going to do to change America or to solve the problems that people felt. So, and that's one reason Sanders did so well against her, too. I mean, she was both too cautious for the left and too liberal for the right and too out of touch for middle America. Even so, she almost won, and she did win the popular vote, one shouldn't forget. But Trump was able to capitalize on that. You put together all these things, though, and I do think it's a recipe for a much less settled political environment than we had in the post-Cold War years when things seemed to be going pretty well. The world seemed to be progressing peacefully. 9/11 was a huge shock. I thought 9/11 might have a longer-term effect on our politics. I'm not sure it really did. I mean, it certainly had effect on people who lived through that and on young people who experienced that. We had bitter fights, obviously, over Iraq and over some foreign policy issues, but I don't know, 10, 15 years later, I think it would be hard to say, apart from some of the security measures we put up with at airports and stuff, exactly what the effect of 9/11 was. Whereas, anyway, so that I think didn't disrupt things as much as I thought it would, whereas I think what's happening now is disrupting things perhaps more than people thought would be likely. So we have this unusual situation, I think, with all these disruptive things happening, people feeling that the political system is out of touch, and the effect of it, short term, was Donald Trump, or is Donald Trump. The effect, medium and long term, is very hard to say. One of the most striking aspects of it is the amount of discontent and the fact that there's so little pushback against the discontent. So my own personal view is that a lot of these complaints are short-sighted, really. That, I mean, I'll tell a story to set this up. When I was at a Trump rally in 2016, early 2016, and a few people recognized me, and they knew I wasn't friendly to Trump, so why are you so harsh on Donald Trump? And I explained I didn't think he'd be a good president, and I didn't think I think he was doing some damage with his demagoguery and so forth. And this woman said, look, I I don't approve of some of the things he says, but we need to shake things up. We just need to send a message that we need change. We need to disrupt Washington. And I said, well, that's fine, but I mean, you could change things and they could get worse, you know? I mean, isn't it kind of risky to sort of put this guy in charge? And this woman, who seemed to be, you know, a middle class, she wasn't, you know, a middle class woman. This is in Northern Virginia, in a fairly nice area of the country, and doing quite well, incidentally, economically. Said, no, we need to shake things up. Things couldn't get worse. And I had to sort of restrain myself from just being a smart aleck or whatever, and not that I always restrain myself in those circumstances, and I said, really, things couldn't get worse? I mean, is that really like in America in 2016? I mean, maybe we could look around the world or read a little history and realize that this is not the worst country, and you know, this current situation is not the greatest degree of suffering that a society has ever had. We're not, you know, by economic measures, by social measures, cultural measures, foreign policy measures, things can get a lot worse, you know, and they probably will, actually. Or they could well, unfortunately. So, but that was very much the mood. And I am struck how few people defend the post-World War II sort of consensus or arrangement, particularly in international policy, where I do think you know, if a historian looks at the world 1945 to 2015, it's a pretty unusual time. And it's a pretty unusual time because of the absence of major world wars, the relative scarcity of really horrible genocides and so forth. There's some pretty bad things, but compared to the preceding 75 years, not so terrible. The progress and prosperity of huge swaths of the world, the relative peace in large parts of the world, and the spread of freedom and democracy, actually, to fairly substantial parts of the world, and the toppling of really horrible tyrannies in some parts of the world, not everywhere. It's not a trivial achievement, the post-Cold War liberal order, and people do just, on both sides now, sort of take it for granted and, you know, get unhappy about things they don't like. Trump doesn't like the trade balance, and Democrats don't like that we're spending so much on the military budget, and that we're eavesdropping too much, and they both seem to agree now that we should never intervene anywhere ever again, and I think this is an interesting question. Why is there such a lack of appreciation, if I'm right, of sort of the basic achievements of our parents and grandparents, let's say, generation? Maybe that's always the way it is. Maybe older people like me always think that young people don't appreciate these things, but I think people need to stop and step back and say, well, you know, what are we risking here if we don't appreciate some of the gains that have been made? And I would say the same about domestic politics as well. It's not nothing, you know, to have a huge civil rights revolution in the area of race, major changes in the area of gender relations and equality, major changes in the area of sexual orientation, and just to assume, well, that all just happened, and we're not even going to think that the system that allowed that to happen relatively peacefully, relatively democratically, with a lot of people being kind of dragged along against their prejudices and presumptions and habits. That's not a trivial achievement, you know, if you look at world history. But everyone takes that for granted, and then they're upset about whatever their favorite thing that they want to happen isn't happening. I don't mean to minimize the problems, but I want to lean against, or push back against the sense that everything's awful, things couldn't get worse, all the discontent is justified. Having said that's my 3-minute editorial interruption and, on behalf of the status quo. Having said that, I will also now acknowledge that there is a lot of discontent, obviously, and it would be idiotic not to acknowledge that as a fact of our politics and our social life going forward. And I do think, and I'll just close with this sort of where I began, really. I think standing here in 2019, looking forward, it is extremely hard to know what the next 2 years look like, let alone the next 20. They're not going to look, I don't think, there's not going to be a reversion to normalcy. I would like it if there were, believe me. I would be happy if we went back to the Republican Party of 2015 and the Democratic Party of 2015. I might prefer slightly the Democratic Party of 1997 or 8 with Bill Clinton. But, you know, basically the mainstream of both parties, I think you could do a lot worse than that in politics. And then I could imagine a few changes in Congress to make it function better, maybe reduce a little bit of the partisanship and polarization. But I think my Nostalgia for that doesn't really matter politically, and I don't think that's likely to happen. Now, so I don't know what's going to happen. We could end up with an updated version of some of the older points of view and the older policies. I hope we do in many ways. But we could also go in all kinds of directions that people haven't expected and that we're not used to. The combination of the technological change, the sociological change, the political instability we're now seeing, the disaffection of citizens from the establishment and from elites, all of that is a pretty combustible formula, I would say. And again, it needn't be bad. Maybe this is what you have to go through to adjust to new circumstances. It's what people went through in the 1830s and 40s in Britain and France. It's what people went through in as you said before, in the 1960s and 70s. So we shouldn't despair about it. I just think we shouldn't expect it to be smooth or easy. Final point, just on the very near future, I do think 2020 is a very important moment, a very important election, just in this commonsensical way. Trump's Republican Party is different from the prior Republican Party. People can debate how different. People can say with some justice that a lot of the elements were there already. There was a lot of there was stuff there to be exploited by Trump. Still, it's pretty different if those elements of the party are repressed a little bit. My friend Charlie Sykes calls the racism, the bigotry, the demagoguery, the xenophobia, the nativism a recessive gene in the old Republican Party, which is now not nearly so recessive, but it matters a lot if it's recessive or not, you know? It's a huge country. There are always going to be people in it who have various views, but it matters a lot if they're governing or not, if they have a president who expresses those views or not. So Trump was nominated, somewhat flukishly, honestly, against all these candidates. He was elected somewhat flukishly, thanks to the Electoral College and Jim Comey and other things that happened in the campaign. He was the candidate of change in an environment where people were willing to take risks for change. People like me who would like an older or different Republican Party, I think if we could defeat Trump in the primaries in 2020, which now looks difficult, though I think less impossible than people think, if he didn't get renominated, or certainly if he didn't get reelected, that would be one thing. One-term presidents don't usually have a huge effect in American history. People here and abroad could look at it as kind of a one-off thing. It was kind of unusual. It happened. Now we're getting beyond that and onto some other grounds. If Trump is renominated, I think it makes it harder for people like me to hope for a different kind of Republican Party. If Trump's reelected, I think it's really harder for people like me to hope for an older kind of American global role, harder to hope for a politics that doesn't get Trumpified in all kinds of ways. And will have an effect on the Democrats, too. That, I mean, everyone will just decide this is the formula for success. You know, bitter partisanship, denigrating your opponents, demonizing groups that don't like you, highly symbolic politics, not worrying at all about actual policies, you know, or much about them, and so forth. Democrats, too, there's a lot at stake. You know, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon is real, obviously. There's a spectrum of views in the Democratic Party, but matters, you know, there's a pretty big difference between Bill Clinton Democrats from the 90s and Bernie Sanders Democrats from 2019 in both foreign policy and domestic policy. So both parties are up in the air in a way that is unusual. Could have third parties, could have independent candidates, could have any outcome in 2020 which drives the country one way or the other. You could imagine an outcome where, I'm making this up, obviously, but the Democrats win in 2020, but then there's a very bad recession, which maybe Trump has put off with all of his deficit spending and other such things, and that hurts the Democrats, but the Republicans don't react by becoming more conscious of, you know, the debt and the deficit and more free market. They become more Trumpy in a way, right? And both parties become more extreme. That's happened a lot in human history. Do you get the third party in the center? How does that work in our political system? It doesn't usually hasn't happened much in our system. I really think all bets are off as we go forward. I don't say this pessimistically, though it worries me, but we've survived a lot of other challenges and a lot of other changes. And it's a mistake. I mean, for someone like me who's been around to Washington for 30 years to say, oh, I'm unhappy that it's not going to be the way it was. Well, I am a little unhappy because I'm used to the way it was. And I think it's underrated the way it was. But it's not good. You can't wish it back again. So we have to figure out how to navigate these new these new waters. But it really is a new moment. I think it's an exciting moment for young people who are interested in politics. I will say this, because I really think sometimes you get involved in politics and it's just not clear you can really change things much. You know, the trains are chugging along whatever tracks they're chugging along. You know, you can jump on whichever train you prefer, but ultimately the tracks are kind of set. You know, that's how politics often is. Sometimes it's like the wild, wild west. There are no tracks. People are riding in every which direction. And you can be young and you can be inexperienced, but if you have a better idea, or if you have a compelling idea, sometimes if you have a worse idea, you can get a lot of people to ride in the direction you want. So it's a more exciting time to get involved in politics, but also a time, I think, in which the stakes are very great, and which, therefore, it's an important time for people to be educated about politics and about history and think seriously about these issues, both the policy issues, the broader political system issues, the issues of global politics as well as national politics and the like. Let me stop there, and we have time for comments, questions, objections.
As is our tradition at PDD events, we reserved a bulk of time for question and answers from the audience. So there's microphones in both of the aisles if you form queues or stand up. I'd like to lead us off a bit. Okay. As part of a long-standing tradition at Brown, a piece of anti-war and pro-peace activism was published in the student daily newspaper this morning in response to your presentation today. The position was basically distilled into the idea that giving your support and your enthusiasm for military intervention during the Bush administration, there's substantively not much difference between your foreign policy and Trump's. And I'd like to give you opportunity to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I heard about this. It made me feel nostalgic for the good old days when I was, protested as a warmonger instead of being protested by pro-Trump people as a traitor to Trump's Republican Party. I mean, no, my foreign policy is very different from Trump. People can prefer Trump if they want, but I'm a much more old-fashioned McCain. I mean, Trump knew what he was doing when he attacked McCain and Romney and Bush, and I'm with McCain and Romney and Bush. I'm for a strong American role in global leadership, both diplomatically and economically, and, if need be, militarily. I think the global order that Trump dislikes so much, where our allies don't pay their share and where we do worse in trade deals and so forth, and where people were idiotic not to cut deals with North Korea, I would, on the whole, defend the presidents of that order, whether it's Clinton or Bush or, to some degree, President Obama. And so I think I'm pretty much the polar opposite from Trump. I'd honestly say my foreign policy would be closer to Hillary Clinton's than to Trump's. I mean, and people, as I say, can think that's good or bad, but I don't think analytically it's true that I'm very close to where Trump is. I mean, if anything, the normal attack on people like me, and with some justice perhaps, is we were too confident about spreading democracy, too confident about intervening to defend human rights, too confident about nation building, insufficiently reluctant. Trump's America first is the opposite, right? And Trump, incidentally, harkens back. This is kind of amazing. Trump's slogan literally is America First. America First, as you know, was the slogan of the America First Committee in 1940, which was against intervening in World War II. The standard argument people like me made, and this is a standard liberal as well as conservative argument from the post-Cold War years, is it was bad that we were so isolationist in the 20s and 30s. It was terrible that we let World War II develop as long as it did, and we got in, obviously, when we were attacked by Japan. It's terrible that we let Europe go the way it went without doing anything or being able to do much about it. So America First had the opposite point of view. Europe's total mess. We need to stay out of it, plague on both their houses, and so forth. And that is what Trump harkens to explicitly. So I think I'm much more, again, for better or worse, in the kind of bipartisan post-World War II, Cold War liberal/conservative tradition of American foreign policy.
Thank you for coming, Dr. Kristol. I have a two-part question on President Trump and the federal judiciary, and I don't mean to limit it just to the 2 Supreme Court appointments he's made, but my first question is, what's your opinion of the quality of his appointments to the federal courts, including, again, the Intermediate Court of Appeals? And second, why do you think President Trump has essentially outsourced the judicial selection process to the Federalist Society when the Federalist Society is essentially led by never-Trumpers?
Yeah, well, not maybe never Trumpers, but at least people who would be much as comfortable or more comfortable in a Rubio or, et cetera, Jeb Bush administration. Yeah. Well, so to take the second part first, Trump, I don't know if it's clever, hit upon a kind of clever, I think it's clever, solution of how to keep as much support as he could from traditional Republicans, which is basically he's followed, as you say, the Federalist Society guidelines, more than guidelines, really picks on the courts, which an awful lot of conservatives care about for one reason or another, either economic reasons or social reasons or just general kind of constitutional reasons. And on economic policy, he basically let Paul Ryan write the tax bill and followed, again, for better or worse, a more traditional Republican kind of tax policy. And that held, I think, a lot of the business community on board. So one reason Trump has been so firm on the pro-life issue when he himself had no interest in this issue and, in fact, wasn't apparently pro-life for most of his adult life, it was pro-abortion rights, is that he sees that's a key issue for a core Republican constituency. So in a certain way, I think students of politics will study this in the future as a sort of clever move by someone who's a big disruptor, a big change agent, but he saw that he had to hold his party with him. And if you did the courts in a, let's call it in a shorthand, in a Federalist Society direction way, and if you did economic policy in a shorthand kind of deregulatory, traditional Republican pro-business way, you could hold those constituencies. And there are a lot of reluctant Trump supporters, I know a lot of them, who say to me, Bill, you're too harsh. He's come through on these two very important areas. We could argue about whether he's really, quote, come through and how good the policies are, but and then they forgive or excuse or rationalize all the other stuff, which they don't like much, but it's not as serious as I think, on the rule of law and democratic norms and immigration and ethnic demagoguing of ethnic groups and so forth, and the foreign policy stuff that I've been mentioning. So I think it's a shrewd move of Trump. I think that's why he did it. The quality of the individual judges is pretty high, I think, in the sense that I don't know all of them, obviously, and I haven't studied this. It's not, quite my area, but, there are a lot of very reputable people who went to very good law schools who, worked at major firms or clerked for major judges and are pretty well thought of, a lot of them, by their liberal peers. And a lot of these people, if they were appointed by a more traditional Republican administration, it would just be okay, just like President Obama appointed an awful lot of well-qualified liberal lawyers to the bench. Jeb Bush is appointing their conservative counterparts. Trump doing it makes it all feel a little bit different, but I'm not sure that the people are really very different from the people you'd get in any Republican administration. He's extremely lucky to have a Republican Senate, obviously, and McConnell as a very capable, from a practical point of view, leader of that Senate, holding all the senators together. That's a pretty amazing accomplishment. Again, I don't know if I like that accomplishment, but as a political science matter, the fact that McConnell held his caucus when it was down to 51 on all these tough votes, and now it's 53, and he still seems to hold them, including on things where I think it's terrible, and I think they should vote against Trump and against this ridiculous emergency declaration, and they should defend congressional prerogatives. And then I look up, and all these people I know and I sort of respect, and have known over the years, and I know what they think, would be screaming and yelling if Obama had done this, and even actually if Bush had done this, I think. And somehow the loyalty to Trump trumps everything else. That is a real question of sort of the degree of loyalty to Trump, given that they don't really like him much or respect him. Some of it's fear of primary challenges, but it seems to go a little bit beyond that into a kind of tribalism. Anyway, that's a long answer to a very to a straightforward question, but.
In yesterday's testimony, Michael Cohen offered the opinion that if Trump lost the general election 2020, it was a serious possibility that he would refuse to relinquish power. I wonder if you take that possibility seriously and if you think our political system is prepared for it.
Say the last half sentence, I think.
And whether you take that possibility seriously, and if so, whether you think our political system is prepared for it.
I mean, I'm not sure we're prepared for it. It's not so easy to prepare for it. I mean, generally on the question of, does Trump carry through on his most irresponsible statements or threats or the implications of the most demagogic and irresponsible things he says? I'd say the answer on the whole has been no. I mean, Trump defenders will make this case a lot. He says this, it's ridiculous, of course, it's irresponsible, but at the end of the day, the institutions constrain him, his appointees constrain him, and he may imply that he's not going to yield power because there'll be some fake 3 million, fake 3 million voters who shouldn't have voted, and he'll claim the election was stolen. But I don't know, are the Trump cabinet secretaries, the Trump Secretary of Defense, the Trump Attorney General really going to go along with that? And if so, Trump can sit in the White House and tweet and scream, but at the end of the day, the transfer of power will go peacefully and legally. I guess I generally believe that. I mean, I think that's been generally the lesson of the first 2 years. But I think it's also too easy to dismiss all the concerns as just, oh, that's silly. I mean, you don't know how much damage is being done to the norms and the institutions. You don't know how much strain is being put on them. You don't know after 4 years whether the institutions will be as strong as after 2 years. If Jim Mattis was still Secretary of Defense, I would have total confidence that the U.S. military could not be used for, illegal or kind of cool, in a Caesarist way or whatever the right way, in a kind of third world way to destroy democratic norms or democratic processes. I don't think it's going to happen with Shanahan as Deputy Secretary of Defense. I don't think it's going to happen with the next Secretary of Defense. But I worry a little bit that some of the people who were there as who constrained Trump have gone, and there are more Trump enablers and fewer Trump constrainers in the cabinet and in the Trump White House. The other point to make, and this is, again, a political sciencey point, I mean, Madison, I think, would be kind of proud of his handiwork today. I don't think he'd be very happy with our president, but the separation of powers has worked. I mean, Congress not so much, but certainly the courts, I think, have been pretty robust. But more importantly, the broader institutional fabric of our democracy has held up pretty well, I would say. We have separation of powers, we have federalism, we have a robust private sector, we still have limited government, we still have a limited president. That's why the emergency declaration is a little unnerving to me, though. Could that be the tip of a spear where it sets a precedent which he then exploits in future months and years? We have states and localities, we have universities, we have churches and synagogues and mosques, we have businesses, we have civil society institutions, NGOs, and none of them thinks they work for Trump. It's not Venezuela, right? You can't have one president who's a demagogue and who can sort of destroy the judicial system, take over half the media, enforce orthodoxy at universities, mobilize the police or the military to beat up opponents. You get a little bit of that. I don't mean to minimize the things Trump has done, but the institutions are very strong. That really, I think, has been heartening, actually. This is a very robust constitutional system, which is not immune to the damage a demagogue can do, but it's much harder for the demagogue to do damage than in a very young system, Hungary, let's say, or a country that's less wealthy, that doesn't have institutions with huge endowments, that aren't going to just listen to Trump, that don't depend on Trump being nice to them to keep the institution going, that can say, we don't care what you say, we're going to pay for DACA kids to, give scholarships to them here. We're going to fund lawsuits. There's just there's a huge amount we take for granted that if you lived in Venezuela or Hungary, let alone really undemocratic, countries that have never had democracy, you really couldn't take for granted. That, I think, is good. I mean, that's been strong, I would say. That's sort of an impressive part of America. And I think it remains strong, but I do worry how much strain we're putting on sort of these institutions and these norms and these processes. The Justice Department, I think is held up pretty well, and people are not being arrested because Trump can say, arrest Hillary Clinton and arrest Jim Comey, and the crowds can chant, lock her up. And I think Trump saying it and the crowds chanting it are really bad for the country. But it's also true that no one really thinks that federal marshals are going to show up and arrest Jim Comey or Hillary Clinton. So or the local law enforcement's going to do that, So that's a good thing and a somewhat reassuring thing. So I guess I'm not as worried as maybe, but I'm not super worried, but I'm not complacent about it either.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
So, I'm a 21-year-old college student. I mainly had pretty liberal democratic views most of my life. But when I would talk to my conservative friends at home as a kid, as a middle school, high school student, it was clear to me that we had obviously grown up with different parents, a different set of beliefs, but I never really got the impression that they were racist bigots or didn't know what they were talking about or were promoting this anti-intellectual, what you referred to in your presentation as this recessive gene of the Republican Party that has now become dominant. And it's been really striking to me that the party in power can survive. I mean, it's only really so far survived for 2 years, when it is so divisive, is so destructive to what we would otherwise consider general good norms of human decency. And so my question for you is, do you think this new Republican Party can survive in its present form in the long term?
I think not, but I also think we're in uncharted waters, so we don't know. So I'd say, it hasn't done that well. 2018 election was a rebuke. We went from a 2016 election, think of it this way, Trump lost the popular vote by almost 3 percentage points, but the Republicans won the national congressional vote in 2016 by 1 point. So the country was evenly split. Republicans lost the national congressional vote 3 months ago by 9 points, about 9.5 points. So that's a pretty big swing. People have sort of underestimated the swing because the Senate didn't move. The Senate moved a little the other direction. And because, I don't know, the House changes hands and no one thinks it's that big a deal. But the actual national movement, that's a pretty big chunk of voters changing their mind. It was a big, high turnout election. And I think the good news is, if you're a Democrat, is at the end of the day, it's sort of hard to, the country right now is about where it was on Election Day, which would probably be about +8 or 9 Democratic. A little hard to see why that's going to change over the next 2 years. The economy's not, which has been propping Trump up among reluctant Trump voters, isn't going to get better, I wouldn't think. It may not get worse, but he's had a pretty good 2 years in the economy. Foreign policy, we've dodged various bullets, and we're not fighting any terrible wars right now. So Mueller hasn't reported yet. So I think Trump is paying a price, I guess is the way I would put it. It wouldn't be quite right to say that, he's just doing great with this, with the kind of administration he's running. Having said that, I am a little, more than a little, disappointed and even bewildered by the degree of accommodation to Trump among Republicans. I think it's an awful lot of rationalization, an awful lot of people who are decent people, who dislike aspects of the Trump rhetoric, coalition, even policies, but, put it in context. The left has its own problems, obviously. The left gives every time I think I'm making progress and winning over some reluctant Trump supporters to become reluctant Trump opponents and support Governor Hogan or someone in the challenge to Trump in 2020, then we get the left of the Democratic Party pops up, or something happens on campus sometimes, or something happens somewhere, and all these, sort of reluctant Trump supporters are reminded why they had become Republicans and weren't liberal Democrats anymore, if they ever were. And so that's a bit of a problem sometimes. I don't know. Rationalization is powerful. Tribalism is really powerful, much more than I would have expected. This is a funny thing. And part of that's social media, part of it's Fox News, part of it's the Obama presidency, which did polarize people more than one might have expected both ways, I think, but especially Republicans in opposition. So it is an interesting sociological fact. Is it Trump specific? Is it going to last? Is it just that he is? We shouldn't underestimate how important he is to it, I guess is what I would say. You can look at it as a sociologist and say, this country is really bitterly divided. And look what's happening, and look what people are rationalizing. You can also step back and say, really? Is it really that bitterly divided? I don't know what it's like where you're from, but, people seem to get along okay. They don't have a heart attack if their neighbor has a different political point of view. They participate in civic associations with people of different colors and races and sexual orientation. They don't seem to be going around persecuting people right and left, State and local governments are healthier than the federal government. Maybe this is just a somewhat perverse moment And Trump plays a big role. I think people underestimate how damaging it is to have a president of the United States, not a senator like Joe McCarthy, not a governor of one state like George Wallace, not a talk radio host, not a, but the president just constantly whipping things up. I mean, it's like it's like in life, right? If you have all kinds of people in your dorm or something like that, and some of them are unpleasant, and some of them may be bigoted, but if there's someone who's in charge just every day finding occasions to get everyone upset about everything, and to point and to exaggerate some incident, and to whip up every grievance and every thing that gets people annoyed, it's after 3 months of that or 2 years of that, the atmosphere is going to be different than if you have a responsible president or head of an association or who's sort of trying to keep things calm, telling people to try to understand each other, doing a few symbolic things to reduce tensions, and so forth. So I think the leadership really matters. I mean, take the NFL, the kneeling for the anthem thing, which is just idiotic and trivial, really, in every way. And the Trump defenders, my friends who will want to still defend Trump, will say, well, it's trivial. So what he says, these things are stupid. But of course, no one's persecuting really. I don't know, African American players in the NFL, particularly. So it's not a big deal, but the degree to which it does just keep people whipped up and justifies, I would say, genuine prejudice and makes people feel that they shouldn't try to overcome their prejudices, but should sort of exult in them, And then on the left, there's a reaction which leads a little bit to the same place also, which is, well, I guess half the country's racist, so what are we going to do? It's a totally corrupt country, And so I think it's a bad cycle that one gets into. And a lot of that cycle has to do with the one leader on the top, I think.
Hi. I just have a quick question regarding this kind of Pinker-esque narrative that you talked about in your talk about how the world's been getting better since the 80s and how there's been a political consensus and it's been pretty much stagnant since the 79 Volcker shock and deregulation and free markets. But also the idea that since the 80s, healthcare costs have skyrocketed, the cost of college has skyrocketed, so wages have been stagnant, the cost of housing has skyrocketed. So my question for you is just do you think those things, because also you talked about how the discontent has kind of been overblown. So do you think those things are real issues that people should be concerned with, and how would you go about addressing them?
Yeah, so no, I'm not as quite as sunny as Steven Pinker, and nor am I as quite as unambiguously, I guess, pro-Enlightenment and all that as Pinker. Though I would say, at the end of the day, having spent much of my life studying political philosophy and much more philosophers who are more critical of a kind of sunny, liberal Enlightenment point of view, when I see all the hysteria about how bad things are, I sort of yearn for a more simple-minded appreciation of liberalism and Enlightenment and markets and so forth. No, those are particular problems, which incidentally have particular causes. I mean, education has a certain financing system in place. Healthcare, obviously, has a particular financing system in the U.S., and there are very reasonable debates to be had about how to fix those things. And it was Obama's top priority, obviously, Obamacare, and it's presumably Sanders' top, or the left's top priority right now, until they got to the Green New Deal, was Medicare for all. And so that's fine. I mean, that's just normal politics and reacting to the problems that are real problems, as you say. I mean, we could argue about some of that data, but I do think incomes have been stagnant. What you can buy with those incomes, arguably, is worth a lot more. Medical care is better in the United States than it was 30, 40 years ago. If you know anyone who got sick with certain diseases 40 years ago and know how long they lived and the quality of their life compared to today, which isn't to say it's not a terribly complicated and problematic system. But no, there are real problems. I would say on the international side is where I think Pinker is more right, if you want to call it. I mean, having 50 years with no major war in East Asia and India and China going from real year to year on the verge of starvation in the case of India, and 60 million people being killed in the Cultural Revolution in China in the late 60s, going from that to the current life expectancy, normal life possibilities in India and even China, leaving aside the politics for a minute, is a pretty astonishing jump forward for awful lot of people. And so there, I think you have that's an easier example for Pinker to make. It's one reason I'm more worried about the international side. I think on the domestic side, there are all these problems of advanced industrial societies, and we have them, and Europe has them. And that's where a more robust policy debate, I have no quarrel with that, on both right and left, incidentally, would be healthier. But the trouble with the Trump version of it is, and I would say, frankly, the trouble, in my view, with the Bernie version of it is, it actually makes it harder to have a serious public debate. So actually, it would be good to improve the health care system and the health insurance system. I don't think chanting Medicare for all without really even thinking through what that means is terribly helpful. I certainly don't think build the wall is helpful on, take another issue, immigration policy, where we should fix the system that is pretty inefficient and pretty, messed up in all kinds of ways. Build the wall is not helpful. And the degree to which people are willing to just kind of revert to slogans is a little bit unnerving. I mean, it's always happened, obviously, but a little more now, I think, maybe than in the past.
First of all, thank you for being here today. My question is regarding, I guess you could call it the lack of courage congressional Republicans are exhibiting right now. I mean, even today, some are talking off the record regarding Cohen's testimony, but very few are willing to go public. So I guess my question is, in your opinion, what are they afraid of?
What are they afraid of? Yeah. I mean, the Cohen thing was amazing. I didn't see it. I was busy yesterday. But yeah, I mean, no one's actually defending, so far as I can tell. No one's saying what Cohen said is untrue, particularly. No one's saying that what Trump did is defensible. They're just attacking Cohen. He did lie, obviously, in Congress previously, and isn't a totally admirable person through his whole career. And so that's kind of the resort, instead of actually dealing with the fact that we have a president of the United States about whom these charges are being made. And what do you think of it? But I'd say the emergency declaration is an even better instance of 13 House Republicans voting. I mean, that would have been an easy vote. I mean, who cares? I mean, it's not like, it's one thing to vote against a Supreme Court nominee with the entire country focused on it, with all the forces behind that nominee massed up and all the forces against it. A little harder maybe to break with your party. This one, so obviously a fake emergency, an unjustified declaration based on a fake emergency with almost no real world effect, honestly. I mean, that's the good news, I guess, even if it goes through. But very bad precedent, which Republicans have really been screaming about, correctly in my view, for 8 years, and really for longer in a way, in terms of congressional authority and presidential overreach and so forth. And they can't even, be tough enough to vote for a resolution, which ultimately Trump will veto, and the veto will get sustained. So again, it's kind of a free vote, That really is pathetic. Some of it is fear of primaries, but that can't explain all of it. First of all, the senators don't have primaries until every 6 years. And secondly, some of them are pretty safe seats in terms of primaries. And third of all, do they really love being congressmen so much that they can't possibly risk anything, and they can go become lobbyists and make more money and stuff? So it is a little bewildering to me, honestly. I mean, the social psychologists will have to study this, and how hard it is to break from the consensus of your tribe or your team or your party. And I'd say, just leaving aside elected officials, where you sort of expect a certain amount of cowardice isn't quite fair, but let's say opportunism, right? Adjusting to the winds. I am very struck by the intellectual defenders of Trump, who, again, there are legitimate defenses that you can make of the policies, I think, and then some legitimate maybe defenses of the overall phenomenon, as people like me exaggerate the damage, and we have to step back and put it into context. And he's a jerk, but nonetheless, all in all, maybe he's doing some good. But the number of people who are just all in and pretending not that they're not reluctant sort of defenders, but they're just enthusiastic defenders. And these are people, many of them, who know a lot of history, know a lot of quite well educated. And that part, I think, is unnerving. Now, having said that, I'll just leave time for all of you to ask questions, not go on so long. But it's not like we haven't been through this before, 30s and 40s. I would say, more than half, I'm making this up, but I would bet this is correct, of the greatest novelists, essayists, poets in the West were either fascist sympathizers or communist sympathizers. I mean, we have case studies of intellectuals going down this kind of path in a worse way, really, in the past. We have studies of politicians kowtowing to Joe McCarthy and stuff. And it's just, you read about it in history and you sort of think, well, that was kind of crazy. I remember as a kid, since I was a kid in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, it was still kind of recent, reading about the famous book, The God That Failed, where 5 or 6 authors wrote about their youthful, not so youthful sometimes, entrapment in communism. Entrapment's not quite right, but infatuation with communism, willingness to excuse the Stalin's show trials, willingness to excuse the mass murder of millions of people. And the same was true on the right, incidentally, with fascists. And, it was sort of like a mystery. How did people talk themselves into this? And now we're seeing a milder, thank God, version of the same, I think, human temptation. Okay, so... Okay, let's take all the questions, and I'll just answer them. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things you mentioned during your speech was at the Trump rally with the supporter was how things could get a lot worse. And I'm just wondering, given that Trump's the president, he's going to be the Republican nominee. There's no really legitimate challengers right now to him. Why don't you view the alternative to Trump as a lot worse, with a lot of the Democrats and a lot of their, the president uses the term socialist proposals, which they are very left-wing compared to, the Bill Clinton party, as you mentioned.
Thanks. Your former colleague, Steve Hayes, along with Jonah Goldberg, announced this morning that they were going to start a publication that's for the Trump-centric center-right. And I want to get your thoughts as to what role do you see these Republicans of yesteryear playing in 2020?
And thanks for the opportunity. There have been quite a number of 21-year-olds. As a 61-year-old who I've been an iconoclast all my life, but one analytical thing that maybe, I don't want to say you miss it, but I think it's important to the story you tell, is I predicted, not Trump in particular, but I saw this happening with the Tea Party. When I went to, I'm used to going there. I've been to, anti-Vietnam rallies when I was on the left, then I went to the Tea Party rally when I'm on the right. I go to the Tea Party rally, and there are, housewives, businessmen, just regular people who would never turn out to anything like that. And that was 8 years before Trump. And I think that the Republican Party, the traditional Republican Party, or whatever it is that they stand for, kind of missed, not that it should have been captured partisanly, but I think that people misunderstood the depth of that phenomenon.
So let me go backwards maybe, because that's a good question. So I would say on that, when you started to say, I think you may have missed something, I actually thought, I'll mention something else I did miss, since I thought you were going to say that, which is, there's also the global phenomenon, obviously. So when the counter-argument to my emphasis on, a counter-argument or counter-emphasis to my emphasis on Trump is, hey, this is happening all over the world, the industrialized world. And that's true. So that gets to the globalization, automation stuff. I think it's not that different in Europe and even in parts of Asia. And that suggests it isn't just an American political system problem. It's not just polarization here. It's not just Fox News. Other countries that don't have Fox News and don't have Mitch McConnell as majority leader are having big, political crises of not dissimilar sort in a way. On the Tea Party, so I would have said 3 years ago the following, and I was interested in the Tea Party, and I was actually somewhat friendly to the Tea Party. I would say that was kind of a success story of American politics. Tea Party comes up, frustrated with the accommodation, the big spending, really, of Bush and of the Republican establishment, and also the kind of lack of populism of the Republican establishment. But the Tea Party rises up in rebellion, and they fight a lot of primaries, and they elect some people, and they lose some races they could have won because they nominate some really wacko people, but they end up being absorbed into the Republican Party, and you end up in 2016, let's just say, with Rubio, who's elected originally as a Tea Party candidate against Krist in Florida, it's Cruz, who's elected as a Tea Party-like insurgent in Texas in 2012, as two of the leading presidential candidates, Jindal, somewhat sympathetic to that too. And I would have said that's how American politics traditionally has worked. You get these protest movements. They get assimilated by the party. This is true of the McGovern Democrats and the Goldwater Republicans. And they also change the party. And you end up with a party that is different from the party before. Now, maybe the Republican Party was less different than it should have been by 2016. And there, I think Jeb Bush the image of Bush almost just distorted it, If you look at a stage with Marco Rubio and Bobby Jindal and, Carly Fiorina and other of these candidates, you might say they're not the greatest candidates in the world, it turned out, John Kasich, but they're not necessarily all kind of establishment people who grew up in country clubs, They're pretty interesting bunch of characters. Nikki Haley didn't run, but prominent Republican governor, and somewhat diverse backgrounds, somewhat diverse views. And so maybe Bush distorted things a little. Maybe the Republicans didn't learn the lesson. Trump was able to tap into the Tea Party spirit without the actual Tea Party messages. I mean, the Tea Party was about spending and the Constitution. Remember the first day of the 2011 Congress, the House, after Republicans took the House with their huge gains in 2010, and the Tea Party was ascendant, they read the Constitution, and everyone mocked them. That's how silly that is. But, I mean, Trump is anti-constitutional to an amazing degree, and the Tea Party at least claimed to be constitutional. Maybe that tells us something about the Tea Party. Maybe it tells us something about Trump. Maybe it tells us something that what I would regard as mostly legitimate protest movements can get hijacked in a way by a successful demagogue. But I take your point generally. We probably didn't take seriously enough the rebellion against the establishments in both parties. This new enterprise, Steve Hayes, my colleague for years at the Weekly Standard, and then took over for me as editor 2 years ago, and then was editor, unfortunately, when the magazine was unfortunately closed down by our owners, partly for being too critical of Trump. So it announced today that Steve and Jonah Goldberg are going to start a new website, perhaps magazine, maybe a monthly magazine, not weekly. It's hard to do a weekly these days. But a classy website with embodying, hopefully, a kind of center-right point of view, a lot of reporting, a lot of analysis, culture, the whole thing. They got to raise money for it. I've been a little bit involved. I hope it goes well. I think there's room for such a voice. When the Standard got closed, we set up something called the Bulwark, thebulwark.com. You can go look at it over at Defending Democracy Together, which really was a shoestring operation, I got to say. I mean, it's got 4 or 5 pieces a day, mostly very limited to politics, not the whole culture back of the book, long essays kind of stuff, much as I love all that. But good, lively, I think. Jonathan Lass, Charlie Sykes, very able people running it. And it's gotten but I mean, it's gotten a large readership very quickly. Actually, about half of the standards, which is kind of amazing when you start something with no name ID, and 6 weeks later, it's getting 50, 60,000 unique visitors a day. It does show me that there's at least some interest in non-Trump, non-left political points of view and analysis and reporting and, what happens to this whole chunk of the political system. So I hope Steve and Jonah have this thing. They hope to have it going by Labor Day. So hopefully as we get into the real campaign in 2019, 2020, I think we'll still have the Bulwark going. We'll have Steve and Jonah's thing. They need a name for it. So if anyone here has a clever idea for a name of a new magazine or website, let me know. And I'll forward it to them. And, that will be, I think, a useful contributor to the political discourse. On the first question, I'm less fatalistic. It's a complicated question, so I won't answer all of it. But Trump right now has about 82, 84% approval among Republicans. When you ask Republicans, some of those Republicans really like him. Some of them are sort of, I kind of approve. He's a little too divisive. He's a little crazy, but he's being kept in line by some of his appointees. He's better than the liberal, better than Hillary, better than Pelosi. Liberal media is unfair to him, et cetera. I've sat in a couple of focus groups and watched reluctant Trump supporters, sort of upper middle class, Republican-ish voters, go through all this. But then when you ask them, well, are you on board for renominating and reelecting him another 4 years? Suddenly it's like, oof, I'm not so sure about that, I mean, he's a little crazy. He's not getting any saner. Some of these people are leaving. Maybe there's been enough disruption. Maybe we could have a little calm, a little bipartisanship. I mean, people aren't foolish. They're able to, at one and the same time, say some disruption is good and constant and excessive disruption is dangerous, right? I mean, it's not a ridiculous point of view. And I think there's more market for that among Republican primary voters than is currently realized. So I think maybe Governor Hogan of Maryland or someone else will launch a pretty serious primary challenge to Trump. We'll see how much traction it gets. Presidents, as I didn't really say this, but it was implied in what I said earlier, presidents in the last 50 years, I believe this is true, every president who's had a serious primary challenge has lost his general election bid. Every president who hasn't had a primary challenge has won re-election. So the last 3 presidents didn't have primary challenges, and they won. As I said earlier, Carter, Ford, Johnson had primary challenges, and they lost. It weakens a president to have a primary challenge within his own party. So if you're a Democrat, you should root for a Republican primary challenge. to Trump. You should give money to the Republican primary challenger to Trump. It's probably better than giving money to one of the 42 Democrats who are running, because who knows which one of them is going to emerge, And so I think that's one of the many sort of wild cards lurking around in 2020. And then there's a big question about the Democrats. I mean, I would say in 2018, if you actually look at I live in Virginia, so there were 4 competitive House races out of 11 seats, which is a lot. 3 of the Democrats won. They took over 3 seats. The 3 who won were all reasonably moderate Democrats. I don't know if they didn't run that much on policy, but they ran more on their biographies and just on not being Trump. And but one is a former military officer, one is a former CIA officer, one in my district was a state senator and kind of a long-time Democratic office holder. Didn't seem scary to my fellow Northern Virginians. They all won. They were all women, actually. And I think most of the Democrats who won in 2018 were like that. And so I actually thought, contrary to the sort of Republican talking point about how far left the Democratic Party was going, that probably wasn't true, and that there was a reasonable chance that we would have a Democratic primary that would have the usual fights, but that would end up with a more or less centrist, let's say, Democrat, maybe a fresh face, but still sort of centrist in 2020. And I would say, incidentally, that Beto O'Rourke, who was certainly the most charismatic candidate probably of 2018, it's not clear how left-wing he is, really. He's a Texas Democrat who didn't run on a particularly left-wing platform. He just ran on a kind of personal, I'm different, I'm new, I'm exciting, I don't know what I do, I drive around the country and write Jack Kerouac-like missives from various small towns, I don't know. But an interesting character, I'm a little spooked by the last 3 months, I've got to say. I mean, the combination of the Green New Deal's fine if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wants to introduce, it's not even legislation, wants to publish on her website a 10-page manifesto with some very vague Green New Deal. That's fine. What was scary from my point of view, not scary, but what was unnerving, I guess, is that so many of the Democratic presidential candidates kind of rushed to endorse it. They couldn't look as if they were resisting it, whereas in fact, it just gives huge ammunition, I think, to Republicans in 2020 to, once you endorse it, it's kind of hard to unendorse it. And now Republicans can say, look, it's on the website that we're going to retrofit every building in the U.S. by 2030, and we're going to get rid of airplane travel and God knows what else. And now we're going to get rid of hamburgers. That seems to be the latest thing. And I also make fun of the Republicans who Seb Gorka said today at CPAC that, the Democrats are coming for your hamburgers. And it's so ludicrous that it's not a real thing. But on the other hand, it does convey a certain image of a party that's a little out of control, subservient to its most left-wing elements. And one of the good things about 2018 from the point of view of moderate Democrats is there are a lot of Democrats elected from states like Virginia and Pennsylvania and Michigan and governors in states like that. And now you look at Capitol Hill, and it's mostly Democrats from California or New York or Massachusetts. So I think it would be better for the Democrats, if I can give them some advice, to try to be a little more middle American, a little more in touch with the anxieties of the Trump voters on economics, a little less culturally, militantly left. I mean, they should be for whatever they want to be for as a policy matter, but they should not look take maybe quite as much pleasure in shocking middle America, because they do need some of those votes, I think, to win in 2020. So whether both parties get polarized in 2020, that's a big question. If they both get polarized, could you have an independent candidate up the middle? Someone like Howard Schultz has had a horrible start. But I don't know, if you literally have Trump and Sanders as the major party nominees, there'd certainly be 15%, I would say, starting off, who would be for an independent. But could you get to 25? Could you become a plausible winner? That's hard. But I think it would be, if ever it could happen, you'd think it would be with a Trump-Sanders type matchup. So, and I talked to a Democrat yesterday who's done a lot of polling. I mean, he works for someone who may run or may not. And I said, any takeaways that are different from what I'm seeing and just reading, public stuff? And he said, yeah, the more you push down, the stronger Bernie looks, which was a little startling to me. The Sanders support remains there. He got 1 million contributors in 3 days after he announced, and people are discounting him too much, I think. So I think it could be a very wild and woolly next 18 months, and it'll be interesting, and I hope it ends up good for the country. Thank you.